A very warm welcome to another exciting edition of China Now, your trusted current affairs program here on Pan-African Television. I am your host, Makiza Latifa, and as always, we bring you the very latest stories, perspectives, and developments shaping China and its place in the global conversation. Coming up on today's show, a bold suggestion by a Chinese professor makes waves online. China's lychee season takes a juicy international turn, and remarkable advances in the country's nuclear medicine and fusion technology sectors. Stay with us for all the details and experts' perspectives. Let's begin with our China Current segment, where we bring you the top stories making headlines across China and beyond. Chris is standing by with all the details. Stay tuned.
China Current is a weekly news talk show from China to the world. We cover viral news about China every week and also give you the newest updates on China's cutting-edge technologies. Let's get started. Welcome to China Current, your weekly news report on the latest developments in China. I'm Chris, and in this episode, Chinese professor suggests inviting Trump to the military parade. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs has not denied this possibility. China Petroleum invests in technology that could help humanity venture into space. And Chinese lychees are sold in Saudi Arabia with a taste just like freshly picked. China's wealthiest list is out, with AI creating new billionaires. And NBA welcomes its 9th Chinese player. Last week, we mentioned that China has announced that it will hold a military parade on September 3rd. Chinese people's imagination have since run wild regarding who will attend and what will be showcased. One suggestion that drew significant attention came from Professor Jin Canrong of Renmin University of China, who proposed inviting US President Donald Trump. Professor Jin, a prominent figure in both China's academia and media, said that Trump's attendance will benefit world peace as well as China-US relations, as China's military parade on September 3rd is primarily meant at commemorating China's victory in World War II, a war in which China worked closely with the US and made significant contributions to world peace at great cost to its people. Citing US President Roosevelt, Professor Jin said that Chinese people for nearly 5 years have withstood Japanese assaults, destroyed hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers and vast quantities of Japanese war munitions. He added that if China had given up its resistance, Japan would have fully exploited China's resources and extended its conquest towards India and through the Indian Ocean to Africa and Near East, and potentially join forces with Germany and Italy. Professor Jin believed that the presence of a US leader alongside Chinese and Russian leaders would send a positive signal to the world that great powers are committed to sorting things out rather than falling victim to the prisoner's dilemma. His comments were met with enthusiastic discussions on Chinese social media, focusing on whether China should regard US as a friend or a foe. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs has not denied this possibility. Moving on to China's recent investment in human life and development. First, from China National Nuclear Corporation, which, in addition to operating nuclear power plants, has developed a byproduct, a metal that can be used for liver cancer radiation therapy. The Qinshan nuclear power plant in China irradiated yttrium-90 glass microspheres, mastering the technology to produce yttrium-90 using commercial nuclear reactors, and now can produce it in bulk. Yttrium-90 microspheres are an important tool for treating advanced liver cancer. Compared to conventional external beam radiation therapy, yttrium-90 microsphere therapy delivers a higher radiation dose, smaller radiation range, and is more precise, reducing damage to healthy tissues. Liver cancer is the 6th most common cancer globally and the 3rd most deadly cancer. China's advancement in new technology is expected to make treatment more affordable for global patients. In addition to CNNC, China Petroleum announced an investment that could help humanity venture beyond the solar system and begin its space journey. China Petroleum recently announced it plans to invest 655 million yuan in a controlled nuclear fusion project. Along with other investors in this project, the total investment amounts to 3.275 billion yuan. Controlled nuclear fusion is considered the ultimate energy solution. If you're a sci-fi reader, you've likely encountered scenes where humanity resources and journey beyond the solar system to extend human civilization aboard spaceships powered by controlled nuclear fusion. The day has yet to come, but we can confidently say that it's near because China has set its mind to it. Now back to the earth again, Chinese lychees are causing a craze among Saudi princes. 800 kilograms of lychees were airlifted to Saudi Arabia. The Chinese delicacy can trace its history on Chinese tables for over 2,000 years, with people captivated by its unparalleled taste and fragrance. However, there's one catch. Lychees are extremely difficult to preserve. The fruit can lose its flavor in as little as 3 days after being picked. For centuries, tasting fresh lychees outside its place of origin has been a symbol of power and status. To this day, legends and poems in Chinese literature tell of a Chinese emperor from 1,300 years ago who ordered lychees to be delivered fresh from 2,500 kilometers away to please his beloved concubine. Today, lychees arrive at Dubai supermarkets with their flavors intact, thanks to over a decade of technology development in China. Since 2006, Chinese farmers have collaborated with universities to develop lychee preservation technology. In 2023, the Chinese government joined the effort by supporting the use of nitrogen packaging to keep lychees fresh for 120 hours. That year, Guangdong Maoming sent over 100 tons of lychee to the Netherlands in a month. In 2024, the lychee preservation technology was further upgraded. On August 30th, 2.4 tons of frozen sleep fresh lychees from Chonghua District, Guangzhou, were shipped to the hot desert region of the UAE. Since then, Chinese lychees can be found all over the world, with a taste that rivals that of its origin. Now let's switch to two Chinese report cards. Gaokao. China's college entrance examination has long been considered by many Chinese as one of the most important events in their lifetime. One exam, one score, one chance that decides your future once and for all. But things appear to have quietly changed. One student made headlines recently for her family's warm acceptance, even celebration, of her Gaokao scoring of 288 points, a score typically considered quite low. Her Gaokao score reaction video went viral online mainly because of her mom's comments that a student has done her best and every child has their own path. As these high school students receive their scores, Chinese billionaires also unveiling their report cards. On June 24th, New Fortune magazine released its 23rd annual list of China's top 500 wealth creators. The latest list shows that the development of AI is reshaping China's wealth landscape. Zhang Yiming, founder of TikTok's parent company, became the richest person with a stock value of 481.57 billion yuan, surpassing the second richest, Zhong Shanshan, by 120 billion yuan. Zhong is the founder of Nongfu Spring, a bottled water giant. Meanwhile, Liang Wenfeng, founder of DeepSeek, ranked 10th on the list in his first appearance. Looking at this list from a broader perspective, AI-driven growth continues to be evident. Among them, Yang Zhilin, the founder of Moonshot AI, a large language model, made its debut on the list with a net worth of 9.39 billion yuan, ranking 366th. And Liu Qingfeng, the founder of iFi Tech, appeared with a net worth of 8.28 billion yuan in the field of AI computing power. Zhong Chaonan of Renze Technology has a net worth of 41 billion yuan, placing her on the top 100 on the list. Finally, let's meet a Chinese basketball player, Yang Hansen. In the 2025 NBA draft held on June 25th, Yang Hansen from China was selected by the Portland Trail Blazers as the 16th pick in the first round, making him the 9th Chinese player to enter the NBA. According to the New York Times, Yang Hansen himself expressed that he had expected to be selected by the end of the first round, and being selected at the 16th pick was a huge surprise. He mentioned that he had trained with the Trailblazers a month ago and had great relationship with their management, but this outcome exceeded my expectations. Yang Hansen, born on June 26, 2005, is a 2.18 meters tall, weighs 119 kilograms, and plays center for the CBA's Qingdao team. This season, he averaged 33 minutes per game, scoring 16.2 points and 10 rebounds, 2.8 assists, 0.9 steals, and 2.7 blocks, with a shooting accuracy of 59.5% and three-point accuracy of 28.6%. In summary, let's look forward to the performance of this 20-year-old player. That's all for today. Thank you for watching this episode of China Currents. If you have any thoughts or comments, please leave them below. See you next time.
Thank you, Chris, for those updates. Now it's time to turn our attention to the big ideas and pressing conversations shaping policy, society, and global affairs in our signature segment, The Thinkers Forum. In this edition of The Thinkers Forum, we are privileged to be joined by Ron Unz, an American theoretical physicist, a publisher and founder of the Unz Review, a platform known for engaging takes on global and domestic issues. Today, he shares his perspective on the wave of protest that recently erupted in Los Angeles, what sparked them, what they reveal about America's current social tensions, and what lessons, if any, other societies might draw from these events. Stay tuned for more details.
The situation in LA, much of what's going on is really outrageous. In other words, I'm not aware of anything like this happening before, with immigration officers, for example, stationed outside schools and going through neighborhoods and rounding people up. And, that naturally has caused a tremendous amount of concern and fear within the Latino, the Hispanic community. His name is Alex Padilla. He's the senior senator of California. He was elected from a state of 40 million people, and he was dragged to the ground and handcuffed by the Secret Service agents or whoever it was, the FBI agents who were around the cabinet official, Noam. So, we're talking about just, tremendously outrageous developments happening in American society, which naturally will cause a backlash. When we're talking about, for example, the illegal immigrants in California, they're probably something like 10% of the population. And the notion of their being treated in such a harsh manner by the government is really outrageous. Even though they're probably only 10% of the California population, maybe even less than that, they're probably most Hispanic families in California. Hispanics are about 35-40% of California's population. Probably most Hispanic families have at least one family member who falls into that category. And there's right now tremendous fear in the community. People being afraid to go to their jobs, being afraid to go outside for fear of being rounded up by the immigration authorities and deported. So, it's just a very, very extreme situation compared to anything that's happened in decades in California. In fact, probably in my lifetime. There are certainly protests, and there's been some vandalism, and a few, stores have been, vandalized and things like that. And that's why, for example, the fact that Trump has talked about bringing in the Marines, federalizing the National Guard, and sending them into Los Angeles is just totally ridiculous. There's nothing like that. There's no sort of violence like that going on. Now, part of the reason this has sort of gotten out of hand is that in the last few years, there really been a massive wave of illegal immigration to the United States. In other words, it wasn't even illegal immigration. In other words, the political leadership of both the Democratic and the Republican parties had moved towards a sort of open borders policy. In other words, a policy of saying that anybody who wants to come to the United States should be allowed to come. And so, certainly millions of people have arrived. They've generally been given, by declaring themselves to be potential refugees, they basically have been allowed to stay in the United States without being deported. And so the numbers have really been huge. And in many cases, that's actually caused a backlash within the existing immigrant community. And so, for example, strangely enough, Donald Trump got more support among Latinos and among immigrants than any Republican had gotten probably in 40 or 50 years, partly because the immigrant community, the Latino community, was also disturbed about such a huge wave of new immigrants coming in, such large numbers of them. And so that basically motivated many of them to support Donald Trump, who promised to crack down on it. Whereas Donald Trump was sort of talking about rounding up and expelling the very recent immigrants, people who had arrived in the last 6 months or year or 2 years, or immigrants who committed crimes, who were criminals. That's what he focused on. What actually has now happened is that the roundups have targeted people who've been living perfectly respectable lives in California for 10 years, 20 years, 25 years. So, in other words, the concern is people who've been living here, holding jobs, being part of the community for 20 years, being arrested by the ICE and deported again. And, that sort of thing has caused a tremendous amount of fear in the community. So if Donald Trump had merely tried to round up and deport people who had arrived in the last year or two, or immigrants who'd committed serious crimes, there would have been very little opposition to him from the community. But it's just that many of the people around him are really sort of fanatic anti-immigrant types. And they really are talking about trying to round up hundreds of thousands or millions of people and deport them all, which, is just totally impossible and irrational. So it's the sort of thing, many times what happens in a political system is extremists from both sides are the groups that basically gain, authority, and it goes back and forth between them. So in other words, until Donald Trump came in, America really had, for a couple of years in the aftermath of the COVID epidemic, an almost open borders policy where millions of people were able to come into the United States without almost any restrictions, because that was the ideological view of some of the more extreme elements of the Democratic Party. And that's exactly what happens. And that has caused these protests to take place. And, in turn, the protests have been portrayed to Donald Trump as being a sort of uprising, a violent uprising of groups in California, which is why Donald Trump was talking about sending Marines to Los Angeles, which is totally ridiculous. Donald Trump has done so many different outrageous things since he became president. I mean, for example, with his crazy tariff policy, with so many of his other statements, that, there's certainly a huge base of people who strongly oppose him. Trump was never popular in California. In other words, Trump lost California by huge margins. So in other words, the large majority of the people in California dislike him, and that certainly is even stronger in Los Angeles. So, I mean, there are all those different contributing factors. But I do think it's the immigration roundups in Los Angeles that have really triggered the protests there. And the sign of it is, for example, the protests are in Los Angeles. They're not in the other parts of the country where Trump is, really quite unpopular for similar ways, or at least the protests began in Los Angeles. And they began in Los Angeles because of the roundups of his immigration authorities, and also because he was talking about sending the Marines and the National Guard to Los Angeles. I mean, that is unprecedented. I think in California, in American law, normally the National Guard or Marines or anything like that are only sent to a city if there's massive rioting, and if they're called in by the governor or by the mayor or by the local authorities. In this case, the governor specifically said there was no need to have these forces brought in. The mayor said exactly the same thing. In other words, the mayor and the governor were opposing Donald Trump's policies. But he took the unprecedented step of federalizing the National Guard and sending them into Los Angeles. I think the last time that happened was like 60 or 70 years ago. So it's not something that, has ever happened in recent decades. And that, in turn, I think, provoked some of the protesters to become much more agitated, much more angry, and in some cases, for example, vandalizing shops, or, setting a few fires or something like that, or waving flags. So in other words, it's the sort of thing, if the government cracks down in an extreme way on protests, on peaceful protests, that can sometimes cause the protesters to become more determined, more energetic, and sometimes even more violent. Though, again, these protests are very, very mild compared to what happened in Los Angeles and certainly other parts of the country 3 or 4 years ago, the Black Lives Matter protests. I mean, really, so many of the actions Trump has taken have been entirely illegal. Take, for example, the tariff policy from a couple of months ago. Tariffs are taxes. Congress needs to pass taxes. All tariff policies are always passed by Congress. But Trump just said, I can do anything. So he basically implemented these tariff policies. And because, Trump is so outrageous in so many of his actions, basically nobody was willing to stand up to him on something like that. So in other words, Trump has taken many actions on many, many different areas that clearly violate the law and the Constitution and the standard operating procedure of the United States. So, I mean, what he's doing in Los Angeles is no more outrageous than his tariff policies or so many of the other things he's done. But just that in the case of LA, because of the immigration issue and because of, the fear being raised in the immigrant community by these roundups, these seemed much more of a direct reaction. For example, another thing that, it happened a couple of months ago, which was in some ways even more outrageous. Trump was basically sending his authorities, his immigration authorities, to round up college students who simply had criticized the policies of the government of Israel. I mean, it was really outrageous. For example, there was a video scene of a graduate student, a Tufts graduate student, who'd simply a year before signed an op-ed criticizing the government of Israel. And as she was walking on the streets of her Boston area town, she was rounded up, grabbed by 6 masked government officials, and hustled into an unmarked van. I mean, nothing like this has ever happened in American history before. Nothing like that. For example, when you take cases of some of the most serious spies in American history, the Rosenbergs, for example, who gave our nuclear weapons secrets to the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War. I mean, you can't get anything more dangerous than that. They were simply, the FBI was sent to their homes. They were arrested and taken into custody. Well, in this case, a graduate student who'd committed no crime, but had simply signed her name to an op-ed in her school newspaper, which criticized the policies of the state of Israel. She was rounded up by 6 masked government agents. And she was kept incommunicado for like 24 hours. So at first, nobody even knew what had happened to her. And, again, these masked government agents have been raiding student housing at Columbia, at other universities around the country. I mean, this is really just totally outrageous. So I think probably those sorts of actions before have probably helped, raise people's anger against Trump. What's now going on in Los Angeles, where people are being rounded up, because they're undocumented, because they're illegal immigrants. But probably, part of the backlash against Trump's policies over that has because people have heard of these other cases of masked government agents seizing people off the street and dragging them away. I mean, that's something that has never happened in American history before. And, it's just utterly outrageous. So, Trump has been sort of violating the law or violating government policy or even constitutional rights in so many different areas that it's not surprising that, some of the people angry about that might be supporting or even involved in some of these demonstrations. In other words, for example, those actions, seizing students who simply had written an op-ed in their student newspaper, that's a clear violation of the Bill of Rights, freedom of speech in America. It's something that's absolutely black and white. So, there's obviously now legal steps have been taken to, bar these actions. And, basically appellate judges have issued injunctions against this sort of thing. But, until those judicial rulings came down, I mean, these actions were taking place in American society. I mean, they were videotaped. They were shown over the internet. So, I mean, that's certainly why a lot of people on all these different issues are very outraged over Donald Trump's policy. I mean, that certainly is causing a serious political rupture between California and Washington over this. I don't think that has ever happened to a U.S. senator in all of American history before. At least I've never heard of such a case. It's just unbelievable, the sort of stuff that's happening. And I mean, part of it is Trump is sort of so old and so out of touch that he's probably barely even aware of some of these things taking place. And some of the people below him are, really very sort of extreme, excitable people. So, in other words, I think they lost a lot of credibility by making all these accusations against Trump 4 or 5 years ago, when he wasn't doing any of these outrageous things. So now when he is doing all these outrageous things, many of them don't really have much to say. People voted for Donald Trump in 2016, not because they necessarily liked Donald Trump, but because they hated the political leadership of both parties so much. And that's also part of the reason that Donald Trump was reelected this time. Not because there was such tremendous support for Donald Trump, but there was so much hostility and opposition to the policies of the Biden administration. For example, if you take Biden's Middle East policies, so many Democrats were so totally outraged over Biden's support for Israel and Israel's attacks in Gaza that they refused to vote for Biden. And that's the reason that Trump got elected. And some of them possibly even voted for Donald Trump or voted for a third-party candidate or something like that. So, I mean, American society is far, far more fragile right now than it's probably been in many, many decades. And so Donald Trump just, as you were indicating, and these demonstrations are more symptoms of a much deeper problem than anything else. And I mean, the fact that Trump, for example, is ignoring so many laws in the United States. I mean, Trump is basically doing things that no American president has probably done in generations. Just willfully ignore all of these laws and government policies and basically does whatever he wants. I mean, his crazy tariff policy. I mean, the tariffs he was talking about implementing were obviously illegal. And in fact, a judge ended up ruling against them. But I mean, the American judicial system operates in a very slow manner. So Trump implemented these illegal policies, and they remained in effect for several months until Trump finally backed down and until, they were halted by a judicial ruling. And in fact, in a number of cases, judges had ruled against Trump's policies on immigration, on tariffs and other things. And Trump had said he would ignore those judicial rulings, which is something really almost unprecedented for an American president to do, simply ignore the rulings of judges on these points. Now, it's certainly true that over the generations, judges have usurped more and more political power in the United States, which really has been a very negative development. But instead of, for example, making a rational case on those grounds and arguing that judicial power should be more circumscribed, Trump simply said he would ignore what the judges said. He would simply ignore the law, which, really is very outrageous. And I mean, one of the problems is that with Trump, having so much power and so much support from a small but very determined base of supporters, I mean, some of these judges probably were reluctant to really take strong positions against Trump for fear that Trump would simply ignore them completely. I mean, in fact, the Supreme Court was, I think, somewhat concerned that Trump would simply ignore a ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court. I mean, Trump is basically just somebody who does whatever he wants. And, it's a huge problem for the United States and for the rest of the world as well. And Trump, I think, is the biggest symptom of the breakdown of order in American society, the fact that Trump is got elected and is doing the things he's doing. I mean, that's certainly a huge factor. I mean, the problem is most elected officials in the United States are despised by the public. I mean, sometimes they're even despised by the people who elected them. In the past, if you go back 10, 20, 30 years ago, there were large numbers of elected officials who had a tremendous amount of credibility and prestige with the American people. In other words, if they said something, people paid a great deal of attention to what they were saying. But these days, most American elected officials, and probably, in fact, the vast majority of them, are really despised by most ordinary Americans. I mean, they're despised not only by members of the opposing party, but members of their own party as well. And you have a relatively small number of elected officials who are considered relatively honest and independent and sincere. I mean, one example of that is you see all of these votes on, Middle Eastern policy in Israel, where virtually every member of Congress supports giving more money and more weapons to the state of Israel. And, for example, when Benjamin Netanyahu visited the United States and visited Congress, I mean, you had 58 standing ovations for him, even though the International Criminal Court had a warrant out for his arrest. I mean, it's ridiculous. And so the number of elected officials in the United States who have any sort of credibility is very small. And that's actually one reason Donald Trump was elected. Because even though he was hated by half of the country, he probably was greatly supported by most of the other half, whereas most elected officials are simply despised by really almost everybody. For example, when Donald Trump was running against Kamala Harris, his opponent, Kamala Harris was very unpopular among Democrats and among Republicans. The only reason she almost got elected was she was running against Donald Trump, and she tried to persuade people that Trump would be even worse. But she herself had very little support. So, I mean, the last few elections America's had, the presidential election, have been fought between individuals, Donald Trump on one side and Democrats on the other side, where the Democrats Trump was running against were so incredibly unpopular, including among the Democratic Party itself, that Trump either won or came very close to winning in all three elections.
Many thanks to Ron Unz for those insights. As protests and social movements continue to redefine civic life in various parts of the world, it's important to examine how different societies navigate these challenges within their unique political and cultural frameworks. Joining us next on the Thinkers Forum is Mr. Shiu Sin Por, Executive Director of the New Paradigm Foundation and former head of the Central Policy Unit of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region Government. In today's conversation, Mr. Shiu Sin Por shares his candid assessment of the emerging multipolar world order, why he believes the dominance of the US dollar is nearing its end, yet no single currency is prepared to take its place. He discusses the strategic implications of this shift, what it means for global finance and geopolitics, and how nations like China, Russia, and blocs like BRICS are positioning themselves for this inevitable transition. Here's what he had to say.
The RMB doesn't want to replace the US dollar as international trade or reserve currency. Europe, the biggest economy is Germany, and only Germany has capacity to play that role, but Germany certainly doesn't want to play that role. First, there's no replacement. But on the other hand, everybody knows something is going to happen to the US dollar some days. They don't know when, but with this huge deficit, both trade deficits and treasury deficits, this government obviously cannot sustain itself. So Elon Musk's reaction to the big, beautiful bill, I think, has some ground to it, because this bill has a lot of interpretation. And this bill is implemented, passed in the Congress and implemented, they may add huge more deficit to the U.S. Government's treasury. If that's true, this is going to be a huge bomb. Elon Musk jump up and down and try to block the passage of this bill. But if you don't pass these bills, what is the alternative? The Trump solution might not be a solution, might even be a bad solution, but there's different view on it. But I don't see another alternative proposal, or the Democrat may have a proposal, but the Democrats will just do the things as they have been done for the last 4 years. I agree with the analysis of some Americans like Ray Dalio. They are in a serious situation. They need to take big actions to deal with it. That's the first time. Now, whether Trump's action is right or wrong, whether it's effective or not, you can argue about it. But if you stay put and continue to do what the Democrats trying to say, the economy is great, unemployment is not bad, inflation is not bad, Wall Street is great, they completely just deny that we are facing, Americans are facing a serious problem, which I think is not the reality. So what you're seeing is that they have huge problems. A lot of people don't want to deal with it, don't recognize it. The people who recognize it may be trying to deal with it in the wrong way, but they're dealing with it. That's what we are seeing. And what happened in Los Angeles now, and now in New York and other cities, is just part of it. Well, I learned that in the early days, they don't want to say the RMB is internationalized. Because internationalized, what does it mean? So a lot of people interpret that it will be widely used in the world and try to replace the US dollar as the international trade medium. But now, gradually, they don't care so much about this. But it's a fact that we are pushing to use the RMB more and more in international trade and investments. But let me remind you, even though we have significant increase year to year, but the absolute amount of the use of RMB in international trade is still very small, particularly small compared to the volume of international trade we are doing. We are something like 2 or 3% settled in RMB, but our trade proportion in world trade is more than 20%. So actually all our trades with the outside world, very small portion of it are using RMB, even though the growth looks like very fast and very significant. So RMB by now, in no way is a major currency in the world, even though we are saying we are number 3 or number 4, right? Close to the yen or already leap over the yen. But in terms of the absolute amount, the US dollar is like 60%, right? And the euro is 20 or 30 something. And the remaining 10% is between the RMB and the Japanese yen and the British pound. Is 2 or 3%, 3 or 4%. So all this talk about we are getting better is just self-propaganda. Okay? One reality is that if you want to be a reserve currency in the world financial system, you have to borrow a lot of money, meaning you have a lot of debts outside, right? Like the US, you issue debt, they buy RMB debt, and they hold on it as a reserve. We don't have debts, right, outside of China. So if you try to buy RMB bonds for your reserve, you can get it, right? Hong Kong is the biggest center for RMB outside of mainland China. Our total currency volume is only about 10,100 million. It's very small, very small. I once asked a U.S. financial advisor how big the volume is significant. I think you need at least 10 US dollars in order to create a market. So the RMB outside of China is not a market behavior. It's so small. You buy things, sell things. You can use RMB and possibly investment. A lot of projects in the One Belt, One Road, maybe they're using RMB as an investment medium. But in terms of reserve, we have a little bit of it, but because there's no RMB outside of China that are big enough so that I can buy and use it as a reserve. And the U.S. government's behavior, particularly in the last 10 years, is problematic. Before that, more or less, they behave responsibly, so using the U.S. dollar is okay. But by now, the situation is changing, and they're doing a lot of things to hurt themselves, while no other people want to step out and say, I want to replace you. Well, there's a lot of question because of the U.S.-China relationship. A lot of talk about the U.S.-Hong Kong dollars pact, but our chief executive, I think yesterday or the day before yesterday, make the announcement or maybe answering a question from a reporter saying that there will be no change to the pact. I agree with it. Hong Kong's pact to the U.S. dollar for realistic issues, because most of our trade, not just with the U.S., but a lot of other trading partners are also based on the U.S. dollar basis. So most of our trade, including our trade with mainland, because mainland RMB for a long time also hold a certain link to, not a formal link, but a certain stable value compared to the U.S. dollar. I don't see any need to change it. I think this is also beneficial to China too, to having Hong Kong using a U.S. dollar link, because a lot of our trade is still U.S. dollar based, including other economies that are linking some way to the U.S. dollars. So it's no doubt the U.S. still the dominant economic force in the world, even though we are getting bigger, even though in terms of PPP, we are bigger than the U.S. But the reality is that they're still the dominant leader, which we respect them. But this doesn't seem to be making the Americans sleep better.
And that brings us to the end of this week's edition of China Now. From thought-provoking conversations on civic protest to critical analysis on shifts in global power structures and economic realities, it's clear that the world as we know it is in a period of remarkable transition. As always, we'll be here to track these changes, unpack the narratives, and bring you voices that matter from China and beyond. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Makiza Latifa, and on behalf of the entire production team, it's been a pleasure having you with us. Do stay safe, stay curious, and join us again next week for another insightful edition of China Now.